Good evening, everybody. Tonight we are thrilled to have A.M. Holmes with us to discuss her latest novel, The Unfolding, a witty and thought-provoking political satire with elements of speculative fiction that begins following the November 2008 presidential election in the U.S. and ends on Inauguration Day in January 2009. As I read this novel, there were many moments when I found it was hard to know whether to laugh or cry, maybe a bit of both, as reality and fiction somehow blended seamlessly. And Dorothea and I were just commenting about how different this novel might hit if you're reading it now if the midterms had gone differently. We'd be having a very different conversation tonight. So with that said, I want to welcome everybody to the Princeton Public Library. My name is Janie Herman, and I am the Public Programming Librarian. It's my pleasure to introduce our author and moderator tonight, but first a few words of thanks and some housekeeping. Tonight's event is a collaboration between the library and Labyrinth Books. The library and Labyrinth work together each season to curate a series of author events, some held here at the library and others at the store. And so our combined efforts means that we can bring a wider array of authors to town and work together to ensure the success of the events. I'd also like to thank Princeton University's Lewis Center for the Arts, as well as the Princeton University Humanities Council for their support and co-sponsorship of tonight's event. Please note the room is equipped with a hearing loop that pairs with hearing aids using T-coil technology. So if you have T-coil enabled hearing aids, you can turn those on. We also have headphones available for anybody who might like to use them. They're over on top of the piano, or I can run you a pair. We kindly ask that you silence all your electronic devices and hold your questions, as there will be a chance at the end for a question and answer, and I will run microphones around for that for you. So, I'm not going to say too much more about the novel or the story, as I'm sure it will be covered in the presentation itself, and I don't want to give away any spoilers. So let's just get on to the introductions. So we have Laura F. Edwards here as the moderator. She's a legal historian. She's spoken here at the library before, and I'm so thrilled to have her back. Her research focuses on 19th century United States, and she has several prize-winning books, such as Scarlet Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Southern Women in the Civil War Era, The People and Their Peace, Legal Culture and the Transformation of Inequality in Post-Revolutionary South, and most recently, and very fascinatingly, Only the Clothes on Her Back, Clothing and the Hidden History of Power in 19th Century U.S. A.M. Holmes, probably someone that doesn't need much introduction, but she is the author of 13 books, among them the best-selling memoir, The Mistress's Daughter, and I'm sure, like many people in this room, that was my first introduction to A.M. Holmes' writing. And then I had to go on to read everything else. The novels, This Book Will Save Your Life, The End of Alice and Jack. She also has several short story collections, such as The Incredible Days of Awe, as well as The Safety of Objects and Things You Should Know. She also writes for film and television, and it doesn't say here, but you also did an opera libretto, is that not?
I've done a couple, yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to do a class in opera this spring.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Experiment.
An opera libretto, that's amazing. And she teaches in the creative writing program at Princeton University, and this is, I don't know if it's your second or third time here at the library, at least. I've lost track over the years.
I'm also just often in the corner back there.
Yes, I have noticed that. I try not to interrupt. Anyhow, so please welcome A.M. Holmes and Laura F. Edwards here to talk about The Unfolding.
I just want to thank you for doing this with me.
Well, thank you for asking.
This is such a pleasure. It's always a treat when you write a book, and each book has different elements, but this one has a lot of history and really I was saying to Laura earlier, was part of how I always loved history, but it firmed up my love of history and awareness that there's different iterations of stories, and the public library, which is home away from home, because who doesn't love the public library? I kind of live in public libraries, so yeah.
No, this was such a pleasure to read. I usually am immersed in lots of boring, dull stuff about the Supreme Court. And, although I don't normally do that, but nonetheless, I read a lot of this. And so I was like, oh, I jumped at this opportunity because it's like, oh, I get to read this incredible work of fiction, and it's beautiful. And so actually the first question, which we planned, which was, could you read some?
Sure, I'll read a tiny bit from it, but I also want to make sure that we have plenty of time to talk about things. So I'm just going to read a little. And
to give you a flavor, because it's just such beautifully written, and it's so witty and so funny, and there's such depth to the prose.
I'm not going to read all this pile. It's just this is a little pile.
Fast, you could.
The Evelyn Wood speed reading version. Sparks notes. I'm just going to read a little bit from the very beginning, which will give you a feel of where we start, and then we'll talk from there. And this is the Cliff Notes version, just so everyone can see. I always even edit afterwards, so it's not what you will read in the book. Yeah. The Unfolding. Wednesday, November 5th, 2008, Biltmore Hotel, second floor bar, Phoenix, Arizona, 1 a.m. This can't happen here. He's been at the bar for 90 minutes. A dozen men have come and gone, having drowned their sorrows, done a little business, and put the whole thing to bed. There are 4 whiskey glasses in front of him, each one different, none of them empty. In one corner, the television is on, volume down. The talking head postmortem will go all night. In the other corner by the window, there's a couple canoodling like there's no tomorrow. And in the middle of the bar, a screwball with a Zippo lighter runs his thumb over the wheel again and again, scratching the flint to spark. Windproof, he says each time the fuel ignites. Windproof. It's on me as much as anyone, the big guy says to the bartender. Humility, if nothing else, requires that a man take responsibility for his failures. You sound like a man pleading guilty, the bartender says. The big guy shakes his head. All men make mistakes, but making the same mistake twice is not a mistake. It's a pattern. Tonight it was like Fat Man and Little Boy got together again and planted a mushroom garden right here in Phoenix. And yet somehow we're surrounded by folks who have no idea what they brought upon themselves. No idea. A man slides into the seat next to the big guy, glances at the 4 glasses of whiskey, and signals the bartender. Pour me one of those, he says. Which one? The one in the middle. There is no middle, the bartender says. The Highland Park, the man says. The big guy looks up. You can call it in the dark. Solanche, the man says, knocking back the drink. You're not one of them, are you? One of what? Well, your hair's wet, so I'm thinking you're one of the assholes who's got sprayed with champagne and did a little victory dance a couple of hours ago, the big guy says. Oh, I don't think so, the man says. I'm more like a fellow who went upstairs, took a dip in the pool in order to clear my head. Explains the smell, the big guy says. Chlorine. The man taps the glass for the bartender. Again. Were you in the room upstairs? I was, the man says. And what did you see, the big guy asks. A generational earthquake that split the terra firma. The big guy snorts. I would characterize it as a heavy metal Led Zeppelin, a grim shaking of the head, the palsied, all-too-knowing dip of disappointment, keening women knowing they'll have crushed male egos to deal with for breakfast, the damp, dull face of defeat. They banked on the wrong horse in the absence of a better horse, while full well knowing it wasn't even a horse race, but really a rat race. That's from the very
So when I started the book, I didn't read the date. And so I was having trouble. I mean, I was having trouble situating myself because, oh my gosh, it should be any number of kinds of elections. And then it ended up being the one that I didn't think it was going to be, right? So it's 2008.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, what sort of gave you the idea for this book? And how did you think of doing this?
Sure. I was looking at the world around us a long time ago, actually, and I was feeling well before there was a Donald Trump even on the horizon as a presidential candidate that the American political system, both sides, had lost track of the American people, the average American person. And so I wrote a short story called A Prize for Every Player. That's actually what we're going to work on next ding, in the opera class this spring. And it's a story that is set in a big box store where a family goes to do their weekly shopping. And while they're in the store, they have a number of, my work is always a little over the top. So they find a baby in the store and the kid wants to know, can they keep it? And, it started because I found out that a lot of the big box stores sell coffins, and that this is terrible. But if you buy a coffin ahead of time, it's really inexpensive. It's like $900. If you need it in a hurry, which often we do, that's the nature of that product, it's like $4,000. And I'm not making this up. This is totally true. And the guy, it's a non sequitur, but the guy who was one of the top Time Warner Media people was originally like American Coffin Company. Anyway, you can buy a coffin in a big box store. They don't have them out, okay? But you have to ask. But anyway, so the family goes to do its weekly shopping. By the time they're done, the father has been nominated by the people in the store to run for president. And that was really the beginnings of my looking at the ways in which I felt that the social and political establishment had just lost track of people. And then things only got weirder from there. And so I was looking at 2008 in part because I looked at the other election where we thought, I went to bed thinking Al Gore had won, and I woke up and things were different. I was like, wait. And I met this guy hanging Chad, right, in Florida. I surfer, right? He's a total surfer. So all of that to say, and it was a cumulative process for me, and I felt that to me, 2008 was a year, well, number one, I bought a big TV, bigger than my college 13-inch, for the election. I invited people over, and there was a sense in where I was living of incredible joy and hope and possibility, and we poured out into the streets when Obama won. And then I also, over time, began to realize it seemed to me to also trip off a reaction that had been just underneath the surface of profound racism and sexism, which we're seeing continuing to just blossom, like in a atomic sort of a way. So that was why that's the election. It's just
No, it was interesting because
digressions in history.
you captured that sense of what I was feeling in 2016,
Mm-hmm.
and so I got really lost for a second. I was
Yeah.
like, "Where's this built on Phoenix?" And yet I understand this feeling, which was interesting because this was not the person that I thought I would be sympathizing with.
Right,
in fact.
right, yes.
Because the big guy, he runs through the whole story. He is the big guy. But he has a family too, and there is this layered story. It is political, but then it's also about his family as well. And you didn't get to the part where you start introducing
Exactly.
the rest of the family.
Yeah, no, it absolutely, it is, so for those who haven't read it, and I'm sure, hi Mom. I know you're on page 37. She's 96, it's okay. She's read page 37 several times. Now she's gonna call me about it. Amy, don't say that. Anyway, so, the question, what was the family. So, exactly. And all digression to my family. It's like, well, and then as a child, I know it's not there. There is that stand-up possibility at any moment that can happen. It is a true story, and I can tell it. But so the big guy is a very wealthy Republican man who, along with a group of his, I don't even call them friends, I would call it sort of his cohort and a group of fellow travelers in his world, is very upset when Obama wins, and they set about this plan to reclaim their version of America, which apparently has been working pretty well for them for a while now. And then his family, his wife and daughter, it's also their story of their own kind of awakening, of a daughter who votes for the first time in 2008, which was very important to me, to sort of show what is that, to begin to realize both the impact that an individual can have and the responsibility, but to begin thinking about the world around you and realize that things may not be quite what they seem, and the stories that we grow up hearing and believing that are both the large global, social, political, national stories, but also the most personal family stories, may not be true. And so that's what's woven into this.
So I was really taken with all the characters, actually, because I found myself at the beginning sympathizing with the big guy and then realizing, oh, actually this is, I sort of felt tricked into really, liking him and
Right.
understanding him, or feeling like I did, and identifying with him. But then you also have these other really fascinating characters. You have his daughter who, she's voting for the first time in 2008, and then she gets involved with, the whole scene at the Biltmore Hotel in Phoenix where, in fact, John McCain, we find out that he loses, and there's this huge drama over that. And so she's part of that, and she experiences all of this as loss. And then there's her mother, who's also flitting in and out here, and seems like the perfect political wife, the perfect rich guy's wife, the perfect big guy's wife, and yet she also has her own drama going on. And as you say, that this is about them as well as this larger political story, but it's really interesting how it's interwoven. And I was wondering how you thought about these different threads, and because you move from one to the other seamlessly, and yet they still seem connected. And if you step back, it's like, but these seem like different stories, but they're not. Right. And I was wondering if you could say something about
That's the part that takes extra time. It's the part where they look like they're seamlessly done. Fine stitching here at the factory. I think for me it was really, so the other threads that are so important, and this book in particular, was there's a lot of things in contemporary literature that one could talk about. So traditionally in America, men write the great American novel. I call it the pretty good big book. Because I don't even think, the great American novel, that's a lot of burden, for anybody. But traditionally men write that book, and it is the larger scale socio-political book about the world we live in. And traditionally in this country, and it's interesting because it's not the same everywhere around the world, women write the smaller domestic book. And sort of in around the 1970s, bookstores became very divided into categories. I don't know if you remember, but you would go to a bookstore and all of a sudden there was women's fiction and African American fiction and gay fiction. And then there was this funny section in the middle called literature. It's interesting to look in that section because it was basically all white men. But they didn't call it the all white men section. And so that always bothered me. And then for my books, I'm a sort of very non-binary, non-attached to any of those ideas writer. So I was like, my books would move from like different sections. I like one book would be in the women's section, one book would be in the gay section, one book would be in like thought. You know what I mean? Like, thanks. That's gonna be its own special thing. So I wanted to try to figure out how to write something that was both a large-scale book about America, but also an intimate domestic book, and to look at those ideas in juxtaposition. And then, interestingly, a very wonderful male writer friend of mine said to me, well, why do you think women don't write great American novels? And I was like, when I stopped coughing, I said it's interesting to think about because we also forget that women weren't in the workforce, women didn't have agency, women were their father's property. I mean, all the different things, or you worked until you got married, or until you got pregnant, or until, you know, but I said women didn't have the access to these experiences to even have the experience of the great American dream or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of questions that this is meant to provoke in a way. It's a digression of all digression.
Do you have a favorite character in this book?
You know, it's like children. I mean, you can't say like, oh, I really like that one. No, I think what's interesting to me is it also was important to me when writing characters that may be unappealing in certain ways, or may have beliefs that I don't share, to also realize that every character is human, and to me, every human is somebody I can feel something for. And I also feel like we're in a time of the desire to say, I'm not for that person, and to really push people away if we disagree with them. So it was important to me that as abhorrent as much of what the big guy, to me, believes and says, is I also do feel for him, and I care for him. And that is an important moment to get to, I think. You know?
Well, no, and he's at the same time annoying and sympathetic, weirdly sympathetic too. And especially as the book goes on and you start seeing his relationships, and you see his relationships, some of them are falling apart, and some of them are being transformed, and he's transforming. And so it is really kind of, I became more sympathetic with him over time.
Well, and that to me also was an important thing, to sort of ask, like, you know, as Meghan, the daughter, is having this really, you know, a large scale kind of wake up of who does she want to be in the world, and what does it mean to sort of begin to think about how one wants to move forward. So, and that's a fascinating, we, you know, here at the university we see it all the time in the best of ways. How do people, and they say, what am I going to do next? And I'm thinking, you're a freshman, just go to class tomorrow. Okay. But thinking about that, and thinking about growing into oneself, and then looking at a woman like the wife, Charlotte, who says when she was growing up, she was asked, what kind of man do you want to marry, not what do you want to be? And so recognizing that we are still in a time when there is a multi-generational experience of throughout our society, of men and women, of gender, of race, of sexuality in a big way. So that also is like, I'm trying to like sort of explore many of those threads in small ways throughout. And so Charlotte was also very interesting to me. Charlotte has a drinking problem, which is also sort of modeled on a little bit like a Pat Nixon and a Martha Mitchell, and maybe a little bit of Nancy Reagan with Joan Didion. Not that Joan Didion was a drinker, but she was skinny like this character. It was kind of brittle. And it was a Californian, and this woman is very California in a way. And she loves Joan Didion.
So I was also interested, the character development is really fascinating. Like Meghan, the daughter, is starting out, she just does what her parents say. You know, she flies to Wyoming to vote with them, and then all of a sudden she has this amazing experience by herself. She flies away from them after the election, and then she has all of this, you know, experience where she's trying to come to terms with herself and figure out who she is. This is woven in with her father, also trying to figure out who he is, although in a very different way, and then the mother trying to figure out who she is. And all of this is within the shadow of these politics. And the race part is really kind of in your face in a way, because the big guy he's a white supremacist. He's appalled by the fact that they're going to have a black man in the White House. And he and his friends are just having a really difficult time with that. But also through, and I thought this was more subtle in some ways, was the gender part of this. Because they're never as open, the big guy and his friends, about women, and yet the women in his life are the ones who are giving him the most trouble in some ways, and perhaps even more trouble than the guy in the White House.
Yeah.
And I was really fascinated by that part, because it's part of the domestic part of the novel that's coming through. It's playing off the politics.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, wondering if you could talk a little bit more. Oh, and there's also this really cool character, Tony, who is, we find out that he's, can I say?
Yeah, you can, it's okay.
Okay.
It's not too bad of a spoiler, but there are some,
He ends up being gay. I guess he doesn't.
He already knew it.
He already knew it.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. Right. And so, and yeah, he's the best friend.
Yes.
And then he also plays this really crucial role as a consigliere, and this is also, and he's sort of moving back and forth between the politics here.
Right.
He's much more, what's the word I'm looking for, instrumental and pragmatic about his politics, right? Worldly in some senses too.
Yeah, he has a longer game in mind, a much longer view. And you know, I mean, just to talk about Tony for a minute. So Tony for me was modeled, and again, so many of these characters really do come out of history, in part on John Kennedy's best friend from Choate was a young gay man who was also, I think, his roommate at some point, maybe in college. And totally part of the family, very, very close. And throughout Washington history, there have always been gay women too, but there was a long history of gay men in very close proximity to power and serving power. And part of it was they had to be closeted. There were various times, there were velvet scares, or times when gay people were thrown out of Washington and their lives were truly destroyed, all kinds of things. And I wanted to sort of pay attention to that and honor that in some ways. And also the fact was at that, you know, a little further back in history, gay men weren't married, they didn't have families, so they also could work really long hours and were very devoted to who they worked for. So, and weirdly, there's a book that came out just a couple months before mine did that's all about gay political life in Washington. And when I was a kid growing up there, it was also right as the AIDS crisis was happening, and I was very aware of men in Washington politics who died alone. Their families didn't know they were gay, no one would tell them that they were gay, and it was intense and bad. So Tony, and in part, is honoring that, and also Tony's, I would say, the fact that his point of view is not really exactly the same as his cohort, also I think is informed by his having survived the AIDS epidemic.
So with Tony here, sexuality, you're revealing this piece of the Washington political scene where you're moving personal lives into the politics. So there's also all of this, though, with the women in the big guy's life. And questions about gender and sexuality are running through all of this, too. It percolates through the domestic part of the narrative, but it also sort of merges up in the political part of the narrative, too. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and how you're seeing gender and women in this. In some ways, the big guy's not really the main character over time.
Right.
Other women start taking over.
Well, the women are very interesting, and there is a process happening in this family where the secrets are beginning to come out. And the big guy, in his own small set of awakenings, begins to realize that although he thought he was protecting and caring for his family, he was actually crippling and kidnapping them in some ways, and not really giving them the space on any level, emotionally or literally, to have their own lives or to be independent of him. And so he begins to realize that, and there's a moment when he actually says, and it's one of my favorite parts of the book, what happens when you begin to realize that you're an asshole? And like, I mean, I don't even want to say it, and like, that's not, and you don't want to think of yourself that way. And so that's a really, I mean, it sounds like that's a really big step for him, because he realizes that these women in his life do matter an enormous amount to him, and he would never think of himself as being racist or sexist or homophobic, but he is intensely all of those things and really oblivious to it, and that is his privilege and his entitlement, is to never have been called out on it or have to deal with it and so on. And so he begins to try to figure out, like, how do I participate in my family in a way that is not oppressive, which is very hard for a big guy.
Who ends up looking, by the end, not quite as big.
Right.
As what are you doing?
Yeah, but I thought that was, to me that was interesting. And he also, he's always sort of seen Meghan, again, a little bit along the lines of like, someone who will marry well and have a nice life. And then he begins to realize, I don't have a male successor. Because again, it is, in his flawed character, it is, of course, always about him, right? It has to come back to who will succeed him. And he believes, at a certain point, that Meghan will actually follow in his footsteps.
So is part of as I was reading this, I was wondering, is part of the story here about he has to come to terms with his domestic life in order for him to ever deal with that political mess that he's creating out there?
I don't think about it in the, like, does he have to fully come to terms with it? I think it's a process, in the same way that he is, the thing that I like about all of them is they are very much evolving, and they are very much works in progress. And so it's interesting to me because as things sort of, whether come out of the closet, as secrets are revealed, as the family comes to know more about itself, and in some ways sort of falls apart, they actually come to know each other better and are much closer, and we as readers are much closer to them as well.
Right.
And so that's also interesting to me, about sort of that intimacy that they all have been holding off for a long time, because in some ways that had seemed safer.
Oh no, and in fact, as you read the story, their flaws make them more human.
Yeah.
And it is interesting to me that they're more interesting because of the flaws. They come together because of the flaws. And meanwhile, although you never say it, it's like he's wanting to make America great again and go back to the thing that is the problem in the first place.
Right. Yeah, there is a world in which there are people who don't, I think it's a complicated thing where he doesn't see that going back is not the way forward.
Right.
And part of me, the other piece that was important to me to have Meghan there was to indicate there being some hope for a very different future. And I think that's the cool thing, is to look at like who will step into that future, and it will be another generation. It won't be the big guy.
So I want to make sure, I have more questions, but I want to make sure to get questions from audience. So would that be a good time to?
We might even have chat questions. I don't know if we have the capability. But my mom always has some questions.
And let me get the microphone. Anybody have a question? Okay, so just raise your hand if you have a question. Oh, right up front.
Hi. Maybe it's just a coincidence of timing, but I've been fascinated recently by the Rachel Maddow Ultra podcast. And I actually, a long, long time ago, got a doctorate degree in American Studies, but have to admit that most of what she's talking about, I had no awareness. But it's also, I happened to, at the same time, read your most recent book, and there's so much similarity. And one, I wondered if you had done some of the research that obviously she's done, because it touches a lot of the same themes. And just in what you were most recently saying, even though he goes through an awakening in terms of his family, and I probably should reread the book, I didn't have the impression that changed his plan.
Doesn't change.
They were totally separate. And also, again, I didn't finish the book thinking that there was a sense of hope, that basically it was pretty grim.
Right.
But also, I don't know how you do this, it's very funny. And
Well-
you mentioned earlier that something about stand-up comedy. I mean, if you just move it a little more,
Yeah.
it could be, it's very, very funny also.
Yeah. So working backwards from the comedy part is very important to me in a very serious sense, because I believe that by making people laugh, one breaks the surface tension. And that if this book wasn't funny, for many of us, it would literally be unbearable because we wouldn't be able to take it. We'd be like, oh my God, I can't stand this. You know? So that's an important part of it. And I think it allows us to tolerate things. And that, I mean, that has, you know, so many roots in all kinds of psychological things too, but it is very important to me to be funny. The not funny part of my stand-up part is I was trying to finish the book, a couple books before this, the novel. I'm trying to remember when it was. I think it was Maybe We'd Be Forgiven. And I thought, I've been in this house a long time. I got to get out. And I'm not getting out enough. So I'm going to go take a course. Do something you've never done before. And I actually, part of what I love about teaching at Princeton is I'm fascinated by history. I'm fascinated by economics, like aerospace, you know, all this stuff. No, I'm going to take stand-up comedy. Okay, no idea that I would be diversity in stand-up comedy because it's all men. It's all very young men. And they're like, oh. And it was really hard and did not go well. But the funny thing was, it's very difficult. And they would say things like the first day they went around, like, I'll just tell you this way. They go, say something about yourself that's true. And so they go around and one young person goes, I don't like it when my brother turns out the light and I'm still reading. And I'm like, uh-oh. Then they're going around the room and then finally get to me and I go, I don't like it when I'm in a wheelchair in an airport and people ignore me. The teacher, I look at the teacher and he goes, no, it has to be something real. Okay. I don't like it when I'm in a wheelchair in an airport and people ignore me. And it just, they're like, oh my God, what is it in our class? You know, like, what is this thing? But what happened was that I finished the book, and then on book tour, you know, every now and then when you're reading, you make a little mistake, like you flub a line. I would devolve into stand-up comedy. And it just, and I remember, like, you know, sometimes it was okay, but other times my publisher would be looking at me like, are you all right? And I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. Whee! You know, off into her. So I've been trying, like, on this book tour, like, please don't, I say to myself every day, please do not do that. Like, if you make a mistake, just make the mistake. Do not deviate. So there's that piece of it. Yeah. On the more serious part, the research part, I think, so I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I grew up in a version of Washington, D.C., where weird things would happen. So I would say to my mother, Mom, remember when there was a warplane parked in the trees over there? And she'd be like, yes, I do. I'm like, where is it? You know, I don't know. Why was there a warplane in Rock Creek Park? I don't know. And then our bikes would get stolen, and the kids who stole them had diplomatic immunity. So he'd say to the police officer, that's my bike. My grandmother bought it for me for my 8th birthday. And I can't go up there. And you're like, but you're a police officer. And he's like, not there. You know? So there was just this very strange sense of the surreality of Washington. And people, literally growing up, people's fathers like, what does your dad do? I don't know. I'm like, really? And even so recently, and one guy's like, yeah, he worked for the CIA. I'm like, yep, you know, I know that. And you realize that these people were literally all around where we were living, and there was such both secrecy and strangeness. So holding that thought, I was always very interested in the period of history from, and it is very much in here with Eisenhower's last speech, and Malcolm Boo's, and there's so much fact in this book, which I'm returning to the historian, because it was so important to me. If I was going to use these things, I had to use them correctly and in a funny way with attribution. But, you know, Eisenhower talked about the rise of this military-industrial complex, and that is what has happened. And that is now, you know, our political system, to my mind, is very largely driven by money, and now by increasingly dark money, which we're seeing. So all of this stuff, and what Rachel is talking about too, is this peculiar kind of under the surface level of secrecy and other kinds of history that are been percolating along pretty much since then, since the end of World War II. So the answer is just yes. I'm really fascinated by all of that, and by like sort of the secret histories of things, because it's all, the world we live in is multi-historical, you know. Does that answer your question?
Wow, great answers to a very complex question. Okay, here's another one.
Oh, thank you. I would like to ask you about the international reception of this novel. I find it fascinating because I know you toured in the Netherlands and UK, and you were talking with Australian media, and it was so exciting to see the Prime Minister of Scotland tweeted about this novel. And I wonder what the other countries, the international readers, see in this novel.
That's always a good question. Some of it we don't know yet because the translations aren't done. So the books, there's a lag time when things are translated. But what is interesting is that my books have always done better outside of the U.S. And I think in some ways, because here, and because of the humor a little bit, and the tone of things, people are like, is she celebrating us or making fun of us? And so it's hard for people, or as I was saying earlier, a bookseller said to me, who is this book for? And I couldn't decide, does she mean who is it rooting for, or who should she recommend it to? But outside of the U.S., people are riveted. They're like, consuming it. They're like, we thought it was just like that over there. Crazy though. But I think that they appreciate it both for the satirical elements and the more serious pieces. And it's interesting because when I do a lot of events here, I'll get questions like, am I supposed to like the big guy? And when I go to Europe, they're like, what did it mean? Blah, blah, a very sophisticated question. So I don't know how it happens, but the response outside of the U.S. has been really good, which is nice. It's a relief for me. Because it's also, I always say to people, I describe myself as a very American writer for better or worse. Because I am really writing about American society and culture, not always as overtly politically, but about the splits between our public and private lives, about the economics of family and sociology in this country. It's always, for me, as much as it's fiction and it does have to be funny and entertaining, it's also about these larger scale ideas.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? I thought I saw one more hand up. Oh, okay. Jill?
Thank you. Thank you for this conversation. It's really wonderful, and I love the book, as AM knows. I also love the dialogue, and many of the scenes, I've said to you before, feel like scenes in plays.
Yeah.
You set the scene and then you let people talk, and it's so crisp, and the characters are developed so deftly by what they say. You mentioned that you thought about being a playwright. Would you talk about that?
Yeah, I actually started as a playwright. Back in 1804, yeah, it's true. This is in the neighborhood of TMI, but I often will tell my students things that they know this because they're here and they know the TMI. I went through a period in the end of high school where I started having terrible panic attacks. My colleagues here don't know this, but terrible. And I couldn't stay home alone. I was like, I can't stay home alone. And my parents were like, but we have theater tickets. And they were like, and they're like, well, you'll have to come with us. So, and I already had a peculiar accidental art education because my father was a painter, but he also was a super health food person and really a socialist and didn't believe in gifts or presents or birthdays or anything fun. But if you went to a museum with him, you could eat Jell-O, which was not a health food, and you could get anything you wanted in the bookstore. So I always used to go to museums with him to get things. So I was like, need some pencils, because it was whatever. If it was in a museum, it was legitimate. And so I also got this inadvertent panic attack education in theater. But it was really amazing because it was Washington, D.C., so we went to the arena stage and we saw all these plays. And I would say my education in those ways really came from Harold Pinter and Edward Albee, who later was an actual mentor of mine, and the English playwright Carol Churchill, who's represented in the novel. There's a crazy scene where Charlotte goes into a swimming pool with all these pennies, and that really comes out of a play of her, Skriker, where a person is vomiting, a shapeshifter is vomiting change, which I remember seeing at the Public Theater. So that really was and maybe the panic attacks were an opening for the depth of the education, because I was so vigilant to the plays, I was like, I'm panicking. But it really was my education about dialogue and structure, and I just love theater, so much. And I wanted these characters. It felt to me that it was important for each of them to sort of have their own rhythm and occupy their own space. So the group of men, the cohort, are called the Forever Men. And they have their own kind of rhythm and banter. And I didn't want to interrupt it with he turned to the left and looked at, Tony and wondered, how could you be gay? I just felt like I wanted to keep it moving and really about the tension between them rather than any sort of interstitial stuff.
Well, there are times in your dialogue where I don't need that, Tony
Yeah.
said or Big Guy said, because they all have such distinctive voices that, it's unnecessary in some way. So I can actually hear them talking at some point.
That's the cool part.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, there good can come out of panic disorders.
Hi, I thought that was is that on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks. I thought that was interesting what you said about likability and how Americans are very focused on that. I can tell you from being in a lot of book clubs, it's just a discussion at every book club. We just go through, is this person likable? In a way that does not exist for TV or movies.
Oh, yeah, it does.
I think that people...
In the development of TV and movies, it's right there at the top of the list. What can we do to make him more likable?
That's
That's
interesting.
like the first, yeah, every
I just think
conversation we have, yeah.
So many TV shows and movies I can think of that I like have very unlikable characters, but yeah, you know. So my question is, with the big guy, you have someone who's might not be liked by a lot of people. So what kind of were you hoping to do with that, to show that we can have empathy for all people, or could you talk a little bit more about setting the main character?
Sure. So I would say throughout all of my work, I'm always writing about human behavior. I'm always writing about what compels a person to behave in the way they do, what are the sort of circumstances of their experience of their life, what brings us, and I talk about this in class all the time too, what is happening now at this moment where we need everyone else to come and pay attention. So I would say 2008 is what's happening, right there on that bar. I think in terms of the likability question, I always am writing about, I ask what is true or organic for this character? What is accurate for their experience? I don't think about are they likable. And I would say when I look back through literary history and plays as well, I think Crime and Punishment. No one ever goes, great guy, what a murderer. Lolita, I mean, we go to so many conversations, no one goes but these are the characters that stay with us over time. You look at Shakespeare's characters, no one thinks, well, that would be a fun dinner to have, right? You're like, I'm not going there. I don't feel comfortable in their house, I'm just saying, You could get poisoned, you could get beheaded, anything could happen to you. So it is interesting to think about that. To me, it is a very modern idea, and in many ways a very American idea, that in some ways, too often, to my mind, and this is a personal opinion, we're reading to see ourselves, to see a reflection of ourselves. When I started reading, which was very early, like Mulligan and all, so, I wanted to see beyond myself. I wanted to get out of my experience. I wanted to get out of my parents' house and into the world. So I think that that's an interesting thing. And yet at the same time, absolutely, we also, when we do read to get out of the world, we also start reading to find ourselves in other worlds, which is a very important thing for many of us who haven't seen ourselves represented in what we've been served so far. So I think for me, it always just goes back to what is true for this character. And I feel like if I can render the character in their own world well enough, their humanity will also be a part of the story. And, it's not meant, as much as it's meant to be entertaining, I'm not necessarily going for easy reading. And that's also a thing that and I appreciate easy reading. It's like when you're on a plane, you don't think, okay, I'm on this totally turbulent plane ride. Let me pick Showa. you don't pick that on the plane. You're like, I'll watch, whatever it is, Reese Witherspoon, and something fun. So I so appreciate the desire and need for People magazine, for things you read in the dentist's office, for ways that we entertain ourselves. But I'm actually writing because I want to prompt conversation and thought. And the biggest thing I want to prompt is for anyone who reads something to think about it, to think about who they are, how they move through the world, and not that they see themselves, but the ways in which they agree, disagree, are activated by what I'm writing.
So can I ask you another question about history?
Yes, of course.
As you were talking, well, first of all, I asked the question, which is the unfair one. It's like, do you like some of your characters better than others? And really, by that I mean kind of attached to them, not likability, but the attachment part. But it seems actually, as you're talking, that history is kind of a character as well. And in fact, all these characters are really situated in a particular time, and you bring in history at lots of points is that Washington is really important to the big guy especially. We have Eisenhower, the military-industrial complex. We also have Meghan, the daughter, specifically aware that she's walking through this big moment in history, and she's trying to figure out what that means exactly. How big is this? Is this something that is unique to me in my moment, or is this something that we all do when we're 18 years old?
Right.
So I'm kind of wondering here, with history as a character, how you thought about that, because it really is actually.
So it is that, you hit on something, I'm smiling because you hit on something that is specific in a way and interesting to me. So part of it for me was, growing up in Washington, we all know when you live in a place, you don't know that Washington is the capital of this country. So you just think, this is a weird place I live in, and some other people live here too. And my own sort of early coming of age as an adolescent was right around Watergate, and Nixon, the hearings were the first ones broadcast, and that was like, what is happening here? And watching that and living in this city as all this is happening, and sense of tension and sort of who is this deep throat character and what's that about and all these things. And then I used to go to this, and it's funny, I was a Jewish kid from Washington, D.C., and my parents sent me to a Christian camp in North Carolina. I don't know how that happened, but we were talking about it. One of my students went to the boys' version of that camp. Someone was talking about, exactly, the other day. And it was a camp where they would pray before every meal, and we had to wear this sailor top that I couldn't get off, and I was like, could someone help me out of this thing? Because the arms didn't come out wide enough to get it off. It was really intense. And Nixon resigned while I was at camp. And the counselors were saying things, I bet my mom was having a heart attack. I still know exactly which counselor. She's an insurance salesperson now, and which is fine. And I didn't buy any from her, but and then I remember thinking, I bet there's a party in Georgetown, and just realizing the incredible dissonance. And then weirdly, a helicopter landed, and only somebody in recent years reminded me of this. And it was William Ruckelshouse's, who was had a high position. They came to take his kids out of camp. It was like, so it was the idea that all of a sudden realizing that Washington was not just here, but it was also this weird rural camp in North Carolina. I was like, oh. So that was a big moment in my own sort of development. And then, the next year, Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford were eating lunch in the school cafeteria, because it still is Washington, and we are the set for All the President's Men. And so you're like, oh, hi. So I took all these pictures. I still have them with my, that little XX10 camera, remember the cube on the top? I have all these pictures of Dustin Hoffman on the set, hey. But that was the thing that I skipped school to go to the opening of All the President's Men, and of course was on local TV, and my teachers the next day were like, we saw you. And I was like, right. So, it was a weird, so that piece of it, I think for me was, and so much within that, the awareness that history as reported, as seen on the large screen, looks very different. We would go as kids to the White House and, doing cartwheels on the White House lawn because Nixon and Pompidou were talking. It doesn't look that way on TV. Do you know what I mean? And so that was, the dissonance was always a part of what I'm writing about. And in our private lives too, that sense of the way we want things to look or sort of present them, and then how does it really feel? I don't know if that answers your question at all.
Well, no, and you have these incredible characters, and they're walking through these situations that are very historically grounded. So, you're starting out in the Biltmore Hotel in Phoenix at the moment that McCain is about to lose, or he just did lose, actually. And then she has a flashback where you go back to it before that. But it's very clear, the characters are really situated in that moment, and their experience there is both intimate but then sort of transcendent in a way that is about history in this broad sense, but it's also about their particular lives, which I thought the balance there was really interesting.
Yeah, and the thing, there's a part where when Meghan goes to vote for the first time, and I had this even just now with the midterm voting, sometimes when you go to vote, it's you've got a little paper screen around you, they give you a piece of paper, here's your ballot, and you're like, this is it? This is voting? And you're like, who counts these? How do these work? And so the idea that Meghan she's expecting almost it's like a game on TV where you would see a vote go up the thing and lights would light up, then one more vote for so-and-so, or $10,000 pyramid or something. The scale of things in the real world and as lived is often different from, especially now, as media portrayed. And I think that also goes into things we talk about all the time, the way the news cycle is, it's like worse than 24 hours. It's now even more accelerated. It's like the 10-second news cycle. And even the way that newspapers used to publish, sometimes morning and night, but definitely once a day. But now every newspaper publishes round the clock. So there literally is breaking news and breaking stories round the clock, which means we're constantly recalibrating. And we seem to be very much enraptured by the presentation of things as much as the thing itself.
Well, and Meghan, to me, was really interesting in this way because she is moving through all this stuff, and sometimes she doesn't realize where she is until after. So she runs into all these people, and she doesn't always know who they are, and then you find out later, it's like, oh, Atlas, a major historical moment, and a major historical figure. And she kind of figures it out after the fact, but she really brings the scale.
Yeah, like having Thanksgiving with Condoleezza Rice, who's talking about her dad, and playing piano and football. Yeah, and we've all had those kind of moments where you don't realize what juxtaposition you're in, and you're like, oh yeah, that was important, or yeah. And the thing too is when you're younger, she talks about sort of seeing her life always after it's happened and in retrospect, and I think there is part of life is also trying to constantly make sense of things. So somehow they're not always in order for her until after they've occurred.
Yes, indeed. As we all.
Right.
When you're at that age, who knows, right?
Totally.
Actually, though, now, who knows sometimes?
All of it.
Right.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, it's like, because you can just, every day you can reshuffle the deck, which is interesting.
Right.
And I'm very interested in that too, in the way that things do happen, not just in linear logical order, but are multi-planes all the time. I mean, that's, time and space is fascinating, and it's getting weirder, as we know.
Indeed. Well, and Meghan, I love the way she moved back and forth in these scales, too. And, I kind of saw her as the figure that was weaving the domestic and the political part together in that way, and it really interesting.
Right. And that, to me, also, like on a literary level, in terms of the male novel and the female novel, would be nice if, in the future, there was somebody who represented just the novel.
Right.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think maybe just before we wrap up here, if each of you want to maybe share with the audience what you're working on next, and that goes to you, Laura. I know you're probably working on something in the wings.
You get to go
you go first.
Oh, no. Actually, I would have to. I'm gonna first.
What am I working on? Well, I'm excited about this class that we're going to teach in the spring that's about experimenting with opera and trying to think about how is opera not, your grandmother's opera anymore, and how do we play with that? So I'm doing a lot to think about that, and writing some more memoir, writing some more stories, thinking about what everyone's like. Well, what's Meghan doing now? I'm like, I have thoughts, so I'm doing a lot.
That would be good.
Well, we'll see. In some countries, it would be good. So yeah, I'm in a generative space right now, where I'm creating lots of notes.
So yes, I was struggling to kind of figure out how to explain what I'm doing in a few words, but there's this moment when you finish a book and then you start something else, and it's like, oh, it's kind of amorphous, and I can tell you different strands, but I don't really know what it's about yet. But I'm looking at ideas about women and property, and this story is now becoming much more complicated and sort of ups and downs of the ways that women were able to claim property. And it's actually increasingly a story about how writing becomes the way that legal authority is expressed. So it used to be that women could own property in all these ways that are about practice and that were contained through orality. And then there is this moment where all of a sudden everybody's like, it has to be written down. This is the thing that's the law. And the writing becomes really important. So I'm interested in that materiality of this moment about why it is that people find this thing, writing, so incredibly important.
That's very cool.
Yeah, that's really cool.
And that is so interesting, yeah.
Okay, so before we do our formal thanks, so at the top of the night, I told you that the library and Labyrinth work together closely. And part of that is also so that we don't overlap our events, or we can collaborate when needed, or be separate. And we usually do a great job of that, but every once in a while we end up with an evening where we have two amazing authors on one night, and that night is tomorrow night. So, but the good news is that one is on Zoom and one is in the store, and they're at different times. And I want to let you know about these because one is going to be a conversation at the store at 6 p.m. with Donald Yakovone, with Eddie Glaude, talking about Donald. He's a researcher at Harvard, his new book on teaching white supremacy. It's very heavy topics tomorrow night, okay? So, and very Harvard-based, by the way, because then very actually Ivy League based because we have a Harvard and Princeton represented there. And then at 8 p.m. on the library Zoom, so if you go to princetonlibrary.org on our calendar, you can register for the Zoom. Tommy Shelby will be in conversation with James Foreman Jr. from Yale Law School. And Tommy Shelby is a professor at Harvard and current chair of the Pulitzer Prize Committee. And he's going to be talking about the idea of prison abolition. And so, I mean, these are two very big political topics of our time. And just somehow both the library and Labyrinth managed to schedule these on the same night. But we're going forward, and we're hoping that people will be interested in going to the store, going home, having a little break, having a cup of coffee, and then zooming in to the library. So, but we thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you so much, Eamon and Laura Edwards, for a great conversation. Let's have a round of applause. And of course, we've got Labyrinth Books is here with books to sell, and we'll have a signing session. And we hope to see you at future events. And thank you for